The air was electric, heavy with anticipation, as rows of cameras blinked red and reporters leaned across their desks, waiting for something, anything, that would shake the silence. Kash Patel adjusted his microphone with the calmness of a man who knew exactly how explosive his next words would be. The room seemed to lean in with him. Then, with no hesitation, he dropped the line that would ignite a firestorm across America. There is no credible information showing Jeffrey Epstein trafficked young women to others. For a beat, the room froze. Then came the gasps, scattered first, then swelling into a storm of whispers, frantic typing and stunned exchanges. Chirons lit up across television screens nationwide. Patel shocks press. Questions. Epstein trafficking narrative. Within seconds, news alerts pinged millions of phones. A claim like this wasn't just a statement, it was an earthquake, rattling the very foundation of a story that had been etched into the American psyche. To the media machine, Epstein was not merely a disgraced financier. He was the ultimate villain, a grotesque symbol of power and corruption wrapped in mystery. His crimes and his death had become shorthand for elite depravity, an easy shorthand headline that demanded outrage. To question that narrative, even slightly, was to walk into the lion's den. And that was exactly where Patel chose to stand, unflinching, his voice steady against the rising tide of disbelief. Some called it arrogance, others a betrayal of victims. But for Patel, it was about more than a single man's crimes. It was about the machinery that profits from hysteria, the establishment that weaponizes outrage while conveniently ignoring its own complicity. He wasn't defending Epstein. He was exposing the corruption of those who shaped the story, those who told America only what they wanted it to hear. In that moment, a hero and a villain came into sharp relief. On one side, the legacy of Epstein and the media frenzy that kept his ghost alive, feeding on scandal like vultures circling a carcass. On the other, a lone figure refusing to bow, daring to demand proof over performance, dignity over noise. But if you think this was just about Epstein, you're dead wrong. To understand why Patel's words mattered, you have to step back into the shadow Epstein cast over America. His name had become shorthand for the worst kind of corruption: money-buying silence, power-shielding predators, influence reaching so high it seemed untouchable. The private jets, the island retreats, the whispered lists of politicians and moguls who moved in and out of his orbit. Epstein wasn't just a criminal. He was a symbol of how deep the rot ran in American institutions. His scandal was America's darkest mirror, reflecting a system where the powerful consumed the vulnerable and laughed in the face of justice. So when Patel stood before the flashing cameras and declared that no credible evidence proved Epstein trafficked women to others, it wasn't simply a claim about a man already gone. It was a challenge to that entire mirror. It was a question aimed not at Epstein's grave, but at the institutions that had built a circus out of his sins while keeping their own hands clean. The stakes weren't about whether Epstein was guilty. Everyone knew he was. The stakes were about what it meant if the very narrative the public was fed was engineered, manicured, and weaponized by the same elites who once toasted champagne with him. This was truth clashing with hysteria, dignity confronting corruption. Because hysteria doesn't ask questions, it thrives on outrage, on headlines, on the frenzy of being the first to condemn. Corruption doesn't seek justice, it hides behind the noise, knowing that when everyone is screaming, no one notices who is quietly slipping out the back door. Patel's calm refusal to bow to the narrative wasn't an act of defiance for defiance's sake. It was a demand that America stop mistaking volume for truth. And outside that press room, the reaction was instant. News networks blasted urgent banners across the screen, voices rising in televised outrage. Activists called Patel's remarks a betrayal of survivors. Hashtags multiplied by the hour. Epstein truth. Patel cover up. Where is the proof? Memes spread across social media, some mocking him as an apologist, others hailing him as a whistleblower. On TikTok, teenagers stitched his words into dramatic edits, captioning them with, "He said what no one else dared to say." On podcasts, commentators split sharply, with one host proclaiming, "Finally, someone's asking the hard questions," while another warned, "This is dangerous. This is revisionism." It was as if Patel had thrown a stone into the still surface of a dark lake. The ripples stretched outward, touching politics, culture, and even everyday conversations between neighbors and co-workers. Was this bravery or betrayal? Was Patel lifting a veil or shrouding the truth further? Everyone suddenly had to choose a side, and the lines were being drawn fast. And yet, beneath the noise, the deeper meaning was clear. Patel wasn't defending Epstein. He was exposing the system that thrives when Americans are too outraged to notice who benefits from the chaos. He was saying the quiet part out loud that maybe, just maybe, Epstein's crimes were less about one monster and more about an entire network of enablers who still walk free. The cameras, the headlines, the hashtags, they all missed it. But Patel had struck a nerve. Because if he was right, if the story America had been told was more about protecting the powerful than protecting the truth, then everything people thought they knew about Epstein was only the beginning. And what happened next changed the entire conversation. Jeffrey Epstein's name carries a stench that clings to every mention, a rot that reaches into every corner of power. He was not merely a man, he was a symbol. The embodiment of elite arrogance wrapped in tailored suits and dripping in the quiet confidence of someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him. For years, Epstein lived as if untouchable, cocooned in wealth and influence, moving seamlessly between penthouses, private jets, and private islands. He was the host of secret gatherings where the world's most powerful smiled for photographs, toasted to their own brilliance, and laughed at the notion that ordinary laws could ever hold them. The images remain haunting. A former president grinning on Epstein's plane, billionaires shaking hands at his Manhattan mansion, celebrities spotted on his island as if it were a luxury retreat instead of a predator's playground. They weren't just guests. They were shields, human armor against suspicion, proof that Epstein wasn't a pariah but a fixture in the social fabric of the ruling class. For the wealthy, he was a gatekeeper to influence, a man who could open doors others didn't even know existed. And for Epstein, these friendships weren't about companionship, they were insurance. If everyone was guilty, no one could be punished. The hypocrisy only became clearer after his fall. Politicians who once posed for photographs with him now spoke with righteous fury, thundering about the monster they claimed they had always despised. Celebrities who attended his parties rebranded themselves as crusaders against exploitation. Even media outlets that had once whispered his name with admiration for his philanthropy suddenly cast him as the devil incarnate. Yet those same institutions had ignored stories, silenced voices, and conveniently looked the other way while Epstein's empire grew. Their condemnation was not courage, it was theater. And so Epstein became more than an individual villain. He was a mask for a system that allowed him to flourish. He was proof of how institutions will enable abuse if it is dressed in wealth, how the powerful will close ranks around one another until the walls crack from public outrage. He was the creation of a network that thrives on silence, deals struck in shadows, and the arrogance of believing that truth can be buried forever under money and connections. The contradiction is staggering. America prides itself on equality before the law. Yet Epstein's story is the very antithesis of that promise. While ordinary men rot in prison for far less, Epstein's crimes were brushed aside for years because his victims lacked power, and his allies had too much of it. The system that enabled him wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, protecting the elite while demanding obedience from everyone else. Even his downfall, when it came, was riddled with contradictions. Arrested at last, headlines screamed of justice finally catching up to him. Yet within weeks he was gone, dead in a cell, the cameras that might have told the story conveniently turned away, the guards conveniently asleep. Officially, it was suicide. To millions, it was the final insult, the ultimate proof that the truth about Epstein was never meant to be known. And still, the photographs linger. The handshakes, the smiles, the island trips, those faces, so many of them still celebrated, still powerful, still untouched. They are the true villain of this story. Not only Epstein, but the constellation of privilege that revolved around him, the system that allowed him to thrive, and the hypocrisy of a society that condemns monsters only when it is convenient. It is this villainy that Patel's words cut into. When he demanded evidence instead of hysteria, he wasn't absolving Epstein. He was challenging the machinery that created him, and then used his downfall as a smokescreen. Epstein was gone, but the system remained smug and self-assured, believing once again that its secrets were safe. But arrogance never stands forever against the weight of truth. Kash Patel's story doesn't begin under the glow of television lights or inside the marbled halls of Washington, D.C. It begins in a modest home, the son of Indian immigrants who had little more than determination and a belief in the American promise. His parents arrived in the United States with accents that drew stares, with jobs that demanded long hours and offered little pay. From them, Kash learned two truths that would shape his life. Dignity comes from work, and opportunity is never given. It must be earned. As a child, he saw the quiet sacrifices that most people never notice. His mother working shifts others didn't want, his father taking on the jobs others looked down on. They carried themselves with pride, even when they were dismissed, even when their names were mispronounced, even when people assumed they didn't belong. Kash absorbed it all, the sting of being underestimated, the resilience of pushing forward anyway. When others slept, he studied. When others gave up, he doubled down. Nights spent hunched over law books, mornings chasing deadlines that seemed impossible. He didn't come from a family with connections. There were no powerful last names to open doors, no safety nets waiting if he failed. Every opportunity was carved from persistence and sleepless nights. Becoming a lawyer wasn't the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. The law, Patel discovered, was not a neutral playing field. It bent toward power, corporations with money, officials with influence, insiders with access. They played a different game than ordinary citizens. For Patel, the courtroom became a battleground where he wasn't just practicing law. He was pushing back against a system that told people like him to stay in their place. His work eventually took him into the world of public service, where the stakes were higher and the fights lonelier. In the Justice Department and later in intelligence and national security roles, Patel often found himself in rooms where he was the youngest, the least connected, the most underestimated. Yet again, the lesson of his upbringing rang in his ears. Being underestimated is a weapon if you know how to wield it. Colleagues remember him as relentless, sometimes to a fault. He didn't accept easy answers, and he refused to bow to the unspoken rule of Washington. Go along to get along. That rule, after all, is how corruption flourishes. He worked late into the night, combing through documents others ignored, piecing together truths others preferred to leave buried. His battles weren't glamorous. They were quiet wars against bureaucracy, against arrogance, against the subtle corruption that thrives on silence. And in those long nights, Patel came to embody something rare in politics, an underdog who fought not because it was profitable, but because it was right. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be doubted, to be underestimated. He knew the sting of walking into a room and being judged before he spoke, but he also knew how to turn that sting into strength. Cinematically, imagine the montage. Patel alone in a dimly lit office, papers stacked high, a clock ticking past midnight. His phone buzzes with missed calls, his friends gathering without him. The world outside celebrates, but inside those walls, Patel wages the kind of battles no one sees until the headlines appear years later. It is easy to see now why his story resonates. In a city where so many rise on charm and connections, Patel rose on grit. Where others sought power for its own sake, he pursued truth even when it meant angering allies, even when it meant standing alone. This was the man who would one day step before cameras, calm and unflinching, to challenge the frenzy surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's legacy, not because he sought to defend the indefensible, but because he had lived a life of questioning narratives that didn't add up, of fighting systems that twisted facts for convenience. Patel's rise is not just a biography, it is a parable of persistence in a world that rewards conformity. He did not win every battle. He bore scars from professional clashes, endured whispers from insiders who resented his audacity, and carried the fatigue of countless uphill fights. But each wound was a reminder, you don't become battle-tested without bleeding first. And so, when the storm of outrage erupted around Epstein and Patel calmly declared there was no credible information to support the hysteria, it wasn't a soundbite. It was the voice of someone forged in fire, someone who had been underestimated all his life and yet never stopped moving forward. It was exactly this history, the immigrant's son, the underdog lawyer, the relentless public servant, that prepared Kash Patel for the clash of a lifetime. The moment Patel's words left his lips, the air in the room thickened. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Reporters lunged forward, and the frenzy sharpened into a storm. Questions hurled through the air like daggers, each designed not to seek truth but to provoke, to corner, to break his calm. "Are you saying Epstein was innocent?" One shouted. "Are you protecting powerful friends?" Another sneered. A third leaned in, voice sharp as a blade. "So, Kash, are you rewriting history to protect elites?" The questions weren't questions, they were accusations. And the atmosphere fed on itself. Television chyrons screamed, "Patel defends Epstein." Talk show panels erupted in righteous outrage. Critics lined up to unleash the familiar script. Discredit, dismiss, destroy. But Patel didn't flinch. His expression stayed composed, his voice steady. Where others fumbled or raised their tone to match the storm, he leaned into silence, letting the frenzy tire itself out before he spoke. That calm became his weapon. Across the aisle, critics and commentators grew restless. Their voices rose higher, each trying to outdo the last in indignation. Yet with every word, their contradictions piled up. Politicians who had once posed, smiling, in Epstein's orbit now shouted the loudest condemnations. Media outlets that once profited from his access now feigned shock at the suggestion their narratives weren't airtight. The hypocrisy dripped from every sentence, and the more they spoke, the more the mask of righteousness slipped. The room felt like a stage, the villain side rattled by its own performance. Their voices cracked, their talking points tangled. And through it all, Patel remained, steady, controlled, unmoved. Cinematic tension filled the silence after each exchange. The lights seemed hotter, the reporter's pen scratched harder. The audience watching from home felt the shift. The outrage machine was rattled, and Patel was not breaking. The room fell into a nervous silence as the next words dropped. Patel leaned forward, eyes locked on the chaos before him. His voice, calm but unyielding, cut through the noise. "I didn't come here to defend anyone. I came here to demand the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you." The effect was seismic. Gasps rippled through the press corps. For a split second, no one knew whether to shout, clap, or recoil. It was the kind of sentence that ripped through the manufactured theater of outrage and exposed it for what it was. Critics scrambled, desperate to regain control. Some raised their voices, sputtering about conspiracies. Others fell back on moral outrage, grasping for the high ground they had already surrendered. But it was too late. The calm, deliberate rhythm of Patel's words had shifted the ground beneath their feet. And then came the stillness. The kind of stillness that makes the hair on your arms rise when everyone knows something is about to snap. The crowd leaned closer. The critics tried to mask their unease. Patel's calm gaze didn't waver. Because he was, about to cross the line nobody thought he had the courage to cross. The line that would transform the debate from scandal into reckoning. The line that would change everything. And with a slow breath, Kash Patel prepared to deliver the moment nobody thought he had the courage to deliver. Patel didn't rush. He let the silence linger, let the weight of the words spread across the room before he delivered the next blow. Second, sealed documents. Thousands of pages locked away, guarded under the pretense of ongoing investigations. Investigations that never seemed to end. If Epstein was the only villain, why the need to bury evidence? Why protect ghosts unless the living still walk free? The villain camp stirred uneasily now. A senator known for fiery condemnations shifted in his chair, eyes darting nervously. A commentator, face red with agitation, began scribbling frantic notes, his jaw tightening with every word Patel spoke. Patel's voice dropped lower, steady but cutting. And third, where's the scrutiny of the people who mattered most? Politicians, CEOs, celebrities, judges. People who smiled for cameras with Epstein one year and condemned him the next. How convenient that justice stopped at his cell door. How convenient that the rich and powerful always seemed to slip through the cracks. The silence after that was heavy, almost unbearable. It wasn't just what Patel was saying. It was what he was daring to imply. That Epstein was a symptom, not the disease. That the disease was still in the room, smiling for cameras, writing the headlines, lecturing Americans about morality while hiding their own sins. The villain figures grew visibly rattled. One critic tried to interject, raising his voice with forced confidence. "That's reckless speculation." But Patel cut him off, Not with volume, but with poise. He leaned closer to the mic. Reckless is pretending that survivors get justice while predators walk free. Reckless is letting hysteria replace accountability. What I'm doing is demanding truth, and if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask why. The words landed like a body shot, precise and devastating. The critic's face flushed, his lips pressed tight, but no words came. The crowd erupted, some gasping, some clapping, some muttering to each other. Did you hear that? He just said what no one else would dare. It wasn't just a counter. It was a dismantling. Patel wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. His calm, measured cadence made each sentence feel like a hammer striking steel. The pauses between his words became their own form of punctuation. Silence as strategy. Silence as power. Flashes of cameras lit up the room. Clips of the exchange were already being cut, captioned, uploaded. Kash Patel shreds Epstein narrative would hit Twitter within minutes. TikTok edits would soon stitch his calm stare with dramatic music. Teenagers typing in all caps, "This is history." And yet, for all the noise outside, it was the stillness in the room that told the real story. Villain faces tightened, eyes darted, rage bubbled beneath the surface. They had built their power on intimidation, on bluster. But now, standing before Patel's calm fire, they looked small. Patel pressed forward. We keep talking about Epstein like he was the whole story. But ask yourselves, why did his story end so neatly? Why did accountability die with him? Why was the system so eager to close the book when the book wasn't finished? The question hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to fall. No one dared answer, because the answer was obvious and terrifying. Patel's eyes swept the room once more, locking onto the cameras. His tone shifted, firmer, colder, the cadence of finality. This isn't about one man. This is about a system that protects itself at the expense of truth. A system that silences the vulnerable while shielding the powerful. And if you think I'm going to stop asking these questions, you're dead wrong. The knockout. Delivered without a shout, without theatrics. Just truth, cold and unyielding. The villain camp crumbled under the weight of it. Eyes lowered, notes shuffled, excuses faltered. The once commanding voices of outrage had been reduced to murmurs. Patel stood steady, unbroken as the room absorbed what had just happened. The cameras kept flashing. The whispers grew louder. Some clapped, some sat frozen, and some, those who had the most to lose, looked like they had seen a ghost. Because in that moment, everyone knew something had shifted. It wasn't just that Patel had countered their attacks. He had turned the entire narrative upside down. He had taken the weapon they had sharpened against him and swung it back with precision. And as he stepped back from the podium, silence blanketing the room. The truth was undeniable. This was no longer about defending himself. This was about tearing down the fortress of lies built around Epstein's legacy. The fight inside those walls was over. But outside was where the real battle was about to begin. And outside those walls, the shockwaves began spreading like wildfire. The moment Patel's words left that press room, they didn't just echo, they detonated. Within minutes, Twitter was ablaze. Hashtags surged to the top of the trending list. Patel bombshell, joined Epstein Files, Ton to truth or cover-up. Clips of his calm, measured takedown spread like wildfire, each caption dripping with disbelief or admiration. He just dismantled the entire Epstein narrative on live TV, one user wrote, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Another fired back, "This isn't truth-telling, it's gaslighting survivors, shameful." The memes followed fast. Side-by-side screenshots of Patel's unflinching gaze and his critics' flustered faces went viral. Someone added boxing gloves to Patel's hands, titling it, "Round 1 KO." Others stitched dramatic music under his line. "If you think I'm going to stop asking these questions, you're dead wrong." Teenagers looped it into motivational edits, blasting it over workout montages and TikTok transitions. Cable news split into camps. On one network, anchors denounced Patel as a defender of predators, framing his words as a betrayal of survivors. "This is dangerous," one analyst fumed. "It sends the message that power still protects power." On another network, pundits hailed him as a truth-teller, finally asking the questions no one else dared. "The courage to cut through hysteria," one host declared, "is the first step toward justice." And the politicians? They scrambled. Some issued hasty statements condemning Patel. eager to distance themselves from anything that hinted at defending Epstein. Others were more cautious, hedging their words, aware that the viral tide was unpredictable. One senator tweeted, "No one is above the law. Not Epstein, not anyone." Another, more quietly, admitted on a podcast, "Patel's not wrong to ask why accountability stopped at Epstein." That's the uncomfortable truth. The cultural ripple effect was immediate. Podcasters dissected the exchange with feverish energy. Late-night comedians mocked the press corps' flustered reaction, one joking, "I haven't seen people sweat like that since gym class in middle school." TikTokers turned Patel's pause-filled cadence into a trend, calling it the calm roast challenge. Everyone wanted a piece of the moment, whether to celebrate or condemn. But beyond the hashtags, beyond the memes, beyond the shouting matches on cable news, there was something heavier, something unshakable forming in the public consciousness. For the first time in years, ordinary citizens were questioning not just Epstein's sins, but the system that allowed him to thrive. Conversations in kitchens, offices, and classrooms turned inward. If this is true, who else is being protected? Who else is untouchable? Because Patel hadn't merely stirred outrage, he had cracked the veneer. He had planted a seed of doubt in a narrative carefully manicured by the very people who once clinked champagne glasses with Epstein. And that doubt was spreading, one share, one clip, one late-night conversation at a time. The noise was loud, but beneath the noise, something deeper was taking shape. When the dust settled, when the hashtags slowed and the headlines lost their fever pitch, the meaning of it all came into focus. This was never about one man. It was never only about Jeffrey Epstein. It was about the kind of nation America chooses to be when confronted with its darkest shadows. Would it be a nation addicted to hysteria, chasing outrage, feeding on scandal, mistaking volume for truth? Or would it be a nation that values dignity, even when dignity demands hard questions no one else wants to ask? Patel's moment in that press room revealed more than just cracks in the official story. It revealed the deeper battle between fear and courage, between arrogance and humility, between corruption and service. His calm insistence on evidence, his refusal to be swept into the tidal wave of hysteria, spoke louder than any shout could. It wasn't defiance for its own sake. It was the quiet courage of someone who knew what it meant to be underestimated, dismissed, and still stand firm. The lesson for the villain side was clear. No matter how powerful the networks of influence, no matter how carefully polished the facade, arrogance always collapses under scrutiny. The system that enabled Epstein thrived on silence and spectacle. But the moment Patel demanded truth, the mask slipped. The contradictions were exposed. And the untouchable aura of elite suddenly seemed fragile, brittle, breakable. But the lesson for America was even greater. Because in the end, it was never about defending Epstein. It was about defending the principle that justice should not depend on who you are, how much you earn, or which circles you move in. Patel's words challenged the country to remember that justice without truth is theater, and outrage without evidence is manipulation. And so, history won't remember the headlines of that day as much as it will remember the choice Patel embodied, the choice to stand calmly in the storm, the choice to privilege truth over noise, the choice to hold dignity above hysteria. In the end, history remembers not the scandals, but the courage to question them, not the noise, but the still voice that cuts through it, not the arrogance of elites, but the quiet dignity of those who refuse to bow. Because dignity will always outlast hate. Service will always outshine corruption. And truth, no matter how long it is buried, will always rise when someone has the courage to demand it. Section 9. Outro and Call to Action. 300 words. Patel's shock claim wasn't just a soundbite. It was a challenge to the media that thrives on hysteria, a challenge to the politicians who hide behind outrage while shielding their own, and most of all, a challenge to every one of us watching. Will we settle for the story we're handed, or will we demand the truth no matter how uncomfortable it may be? Because what Kash Patel revealed in that press room went beyond Epstein. It struck at the core of America's conscience. Truth versus hysteria. Dignity versus corruption, courage versus silence. And in that moment, Patel chose courage. He chose evidence. He chose dignity. The lesson is as old as history itself. Outrage fades, scandals blur, but courage endures. The names of the powerful may dominate headlines, but history remembers the ones who had the audacity to ask the questions others feared. History remembers the brave, and now the choice is yours. If you believe dignity beats hate, share this story. If you believe truth should rise above hysteria, be the one to spread it. And if you want to see more moments like this, more stories where courage stands tall against corruption, subscribe and join us. Because this is more than a video, it's a movement. A reminder that when arrogance trembles before truth, when corruption crumbles before dignity, America inches closer to the nation it was always meant to be. The cameras may fade, the headlines may change, but one truth will remain. History remembers the brave. Patel's shock claim wasn't just a soundbite. It was a challenge. A challenge to the media that thrives on hysteria. A challenge to the politicians who hide behind outrage while shielding their own. And most of all, a challenge to every one of us watching. Will we settle for the story we're handed, or will we demand the truth no matter how uncomfortable it may be? Because what Kash Patel revealed in that press room went beyond Epstein. It struck at the core of America's conscience. Truth versus hysteria. Dignity versus corruption. Courage versus silence. And in that moment, Patel chose courage. He chose evidence. He chose dignity. The lesson is as old as history itself. Outrage fades, scandals blur, but courage endures. The names of the powerful may dominate headlines, but history remembers the ones who had the audacity to ask the questions others feared. History remembers the brave. And now, the choice is yours. If you believe dignity beats hate, share this story. If you believe truth should rise above hysteria, be the one to spread it. And if you want to see more moments like this, more stories where courage stands tall against corruption, subscribe and join us. Because this is more than a video, it's a movement. A reminder that when arrogance trembles before truth, when corruption crumbles before dignity, America inches closer to the nation it was always meant to be. The cameras may fade, the headlines may change, but one truth will remain. History remembers the brave.